Policies here at the Center for Tribes. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Using Geographic Information Systems, GIS, to Strengthen Practice and Inform Policy in Tribal Child Welfare Agencies. So speaking of geography, let's kick it off with a map of sorts. We like starting presentations with a little roadmap just to keep us all moving together and on course, at least for the next hour and a half or so. So at our first stop, I will have the pleasure of introducing you to our three amazing speakers who will be sharing their wisdom, knowledge, and experience with us today. Then we're going to answer the question that many of you might be having right now. What is GIS? This will be a high-level overview of the technology and what it's like to start using it in a child welfare agency. After that, we'll discuss a sense of place, a deeper dive into the importance of geographic knowledge in Indigenous culture, history, and communities. And then finally, we'll talk more about applying that GIS technology, specifically to tribal child welfare and social service issues. And just a reminder, like Laura said a moment ago, we will be pausing after each section to offer an opportunity for questions and discussion. Okay, so let me introduce our presenters. First, our Senior Geocultural Advisor, John Gozencenter, has over 30 years of experience empowering Native communities in the use of new technologies, such as GIS. He is an enrolled member of the Oglala Lakota and serves in an advisory capacity within the Oglala Lakota Nation. As a member of the Oglala Lakota Tribal Historic Preservation Advisory Council, John helps Native organizations and emerging professionals with a belief in ancestral ideals that keep alive the entrepreneurial spirit needed for success. Catherine Kulbicki is a child welfare program specialist at the Children's Bureau. Prior to coming to Children's Bureau, she led numerous GIS projects with child welfare agencies, exploring issues like transportation solutions, optimization of resources, and placement stability for children in foster care. Ms. Kulbicki is also very nearly Dr. Kulbicki. She's currently a doctoral candidate in the Department of Geography and Geoinformation Science at George Mason University. Finally, Summer Lengerman is a social worker at Sicangu Child and Family Services, located on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. She is an enrolled member of the Sicangu Lakota Oyate and has 13 years of experience working with individuals and families in the areas of domestic violence, sexual assault, youth empowerment, education equity in tribal communities, child welfare, and maternal and child health. She holds a bachelor's degree in business administration with a focus in tribal communities and a minor in federal Indian law. She is also a trainer in trauma-informed care. And because apparently that's not enough to keep her busy, Summer also started graduate school this week. So many of you are probably already familiar with the Capacity Building Center for Tribes, but just in case this is your first time joining us, let me quickly tell you a little bit about who we are. The Center for Tribes is funded by the Children's Bureau as part of the Child Welfare Capacity Building Collaborative. The center offers an array of services to tribal child welfare programs who receive Title IV-B or Title IV-E funding. This includes products and tools available online, peer networking activities, training academies, and individualized expert consultation. These services all work in combination with one another to meet your program's specific needs. And of course, all our services and resources are completely free of charge. So I'll be back a little later to tell you more about our data and technology resources. But for right now, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine. So Catherine, tell us, what is GIS?
Thanks, Marnie. Yes, I'm here to give an overview about what GIS is. So GIS is short for Geographic Information Systems. And this is a hardware and software program that allows you to visualize data spatially. And data is so important as part of our everyday lives of what we're collecting and what we're doing as part of our child welfare agencies. And this is a new way to interpret and to understand our caseloads, our caseworkers, and what's going on in our lives. So what GIS does, I'm glad we have cameras, is allows us to use layers. So we start with our base layer of our environment about what's going on, and then we can toggle on additional layers with our caseworkers, our foster homes, our different homes, and we can start to build this in with our street network so we can really start to understand the whole array of our community. And this is just done through multiple data layers and multiple ways to interpret and use data to make data-driven decisions. So next slide. So this is done basically using simple data to understand what's going on. geographic data is based primarily with point, lines, and polygons. There's also raster and some imagery data, but for the purposes of what we're doing and for the analysis that we're doing, we focus on these three types of data sets. And it's a way to really understand our community. We can see in this map example here that the Black Hills is a polygon, and then we have a dot representing a point on the map. And then you can see our road network and our river networks all around. So we can start to understand and ground ourselves where in the community we're located. We can start to have a representation of what's going on in the area around us. And this is all done through our geographic levels of data and how we want to display them, how we want to use them, how we want to protect our data, and how we want to show and display what's going on in our communities. Next slide. So when we think about GIS, a lot of people don't necessarily associate GIS with child welfare. But this is an image that was developed through the Capacity Building Center for Tribes, and it shows how GIS is really an integral part of our whole communities. And John's going to talk next about the spatial awareness and how this is in our culture and our native values, and we display that through the roots of the tree. Then with the trunk of the tree, we have the geographic awareness, and that's our root and our foundation. And we all have it within ourselves. And I think Summer is going to give some great examples of how she really learned how to harness her geographic awareness. And then all of the, what we're calling fruits in the tree, are all the different ways GIS can really be used in our community. And this can really be done through a holistic approach of looking at how GIS not only helps our transportation units where it's commonly used, or our cultural preservation units, it can really be used across a whole broad array of our community to understand what's going on, and should be used as a holistic approach and not be siloed necessarily within agencies, because it allows us to see everything that's going on in our community and really make good decisions about our community and our community resources. Next slide. So GIS for people, and again, this is a very quick high overview of what GIS is and what the background is. And I think you'll see more applicable how it's been used by Summer in the child welfare agencies in the next coming slides. But GIS is really commonly being used right now. And when you're thinking about the health maps and everything that's being displayed constantly visually right now, people are really used to using GIS. And all of these maps are built on dashboards that are using GIS in the background. They're helping us to see real-time decisions and real-time displays of what's going on. And it's a way for us to really interpret data and make data meaningful to us. Because when you see large spreadsheets or large tables or large graphs, sometimes data doesn't become personal. It becomes a little, how does that relate to me? But when you can see it on a map, you're automatically going to look at what your community is, and you're going to see what's driving the factors around you and how it impacts you. And it starts to make data more on a personal level and sometimes more on an abstract level. And on many of these community health maps, you can click on multiple different layers within them, and you can see how data is changing and how different displays of data can constantly be viewed or changed by clicking on or clicking off different layers on maps. So when we think about GIS and child welfare, there's so many questions that are all surrounded by where. And when John and I have gone out to different tribal communities and we talked about, why this could be important to use and what it is, we hear so many times the questions, where are children being placed? Where are ICWA children? Where are non-ICWA children? How can we better serve them? Where are our foster parents? Where do we need to recruit them? And where are overall resources, and how do we plan for them? And how do we accommodate for our costs? All of these decisions and all of these can be answered through geography and understanding a geographic awareness. We can quantify these decisions, we can base them on statistics, we can base them on facts, and no longer base them on decisions of just saying, this is what my feeling is. I think everybody's over there, but I'm not really sure. I forgot about all these cases over there. So what it allows us to do is really make strong decisions and have a strong quantifiable way to understand what's going on in our communities and to answer these key questions that are constantly being answered in child welfare. So it's a lot to undertake what's going on and what I said, and definitely very intimidating when John and I would go out to tribes and we would talk about this with tribes as a way to have some data sovereignty and to make decisions with their data. So we did this with Summer, and she's going to join in next. And we talked with Summer about what did she first think? Because Summer's had a lot of success in using this. And what were her first thoughts when we approached this idea with her? So Summer, you're on mute.
Alrighty, hello everybody. I'm super excited to be here sharing our thoughts and our ideas and experiences with you guys in regards to GIS and how we can use GIS as a tool for child welfare. So working with Catherine and John and the Capacity Building Center for Tribes, I really did not know anything about GIS. I just was pretty clueless about it. And the opportunity came up through our agency to kind of dive into this GIS project and see if we could do something with it. And so I was volunteered, and I'm really thankful that I was given the opportunity because it turned into a project that I feel very strongly about. So some of the first things initially when visiting with Catherine and John was just not knowing if I had the background or the skill set to take this on. Because when you hear the term geographic information system, it sounds really technical, and it sounds, you know, like for me it was, is this something beyond my capability? But thankfully, Catherine and John helped connect my everyday experiences to GIS. And so being able to say, well, you use maps every day, that's GIS. And so then I'm like, oh, okay, well, maybe I can get through this. I use maps all the time. I use GPS all the time. And being able to understand that we are naturally spatial thinkers. And John helped really bring that home for me, because as Indigenous people and in our tribal communities, we are spatial thinkers. And being able to identify how that thought processes and how we apply our everyday existence really fits into the idea behind GIS. So they helped me kind of reassure me that I am capable of figuring this out. I was super excited. I'm always up for a challenge. So I'm super excited. I was willing, motivated, and through their encouragement, they helped keep me on track, because this is a process. We've been working on this for, I think, 2.5 years now. So it's a process, but it has been very rewarding. So what makes it is challenging, because you have to really educate yourself on the terminology, you know, organizing, identifying information and data. But it's super exciting, because once you get into identifying and finding the information that you're looking for to help find solutions to the questions that you might have, it's really exciting when those solutions start forming and you can see the big picture from the data that you're looking at. That's really exciting, and that's what keeps me motivated to keep doing this work. So being surprised at how much GIS was already a part of my life and my upbringing and who we are as Indigenous people really helped me to solidify this really value that I have now with GIS, that this is an important tool for Indigenous communities and how we can push and change and be innovative and creative in how we further the work of our child welfare work. So one example that when I was talking with John about identifying the spatial thinker in me was just in how we give directions. And it's a really funny story that I didn't realize was so relevant to doing GIS work. But, you know, in a lot of our communities, especially in rural areas, we don't have the physical addresses. And so a lot of our spatial thinking is, you know, you drive 8 miles down the dirt road and you head north by the big tree. You know, that's spatial thinking. That's how we relate to our surroundings spatially. So the natural thinking of things was really cool for me to understand. So the first thoughts of GIS was, how do I need to start from the very bottom and build this up, or are there other resources around me that are already using GIS? And it was a relief that, you know, realizing that there were a lot of other departments in Rosebud that were using GIS. And so, like, our Tribal Historic Preservation Office has a ton of information. Our IT department, our road department, our dams department, game fish and parks, housing. There was a lot of tribal programs that were already using GIS. So it was nice to know that I didn't need to go very far for data information, for support, for help, for collaboration. So that was a big relief. So if you're thinking and you're curious about doing GIS, one of the first things that I would recommend or encourage you to do is just kind of do an inventory of what other programs in your area that are already using GIS. Applying GIS data to our work, it was really, really important because it helped us further understand what other resources, what other systems are out there, economic systems that are already functioning within our communities. So we look at, one of the questions that we had was, you know, culturally within our communities, what other systems are already working that we don't normally identify that help support our communities and families? So we had identified, you know, there's a barter system within our communities. We have families that make goods and they trade for other goods that other people are making, and that's helping sustain their family. Food sovereignty. We had a lot of people that were growing their own foods, that were very knowledgeable in our traditional foods that are just growing in our area. Our traditional cultural resources for mental health and for medicinal health. So GIS can really be useful, and it helps you kind of get your wheels turning about what are other things that we can utilize to help promote our work as an agency, but also making sure that we are meeting other needs of our communities. Next slide.
So I think we'll take a minute right here and ask anybody if there's any time for questions or discussions about first thoughts or first inklings about what GIS is as we move into what a sense of place is and why geography is so important to tribes.
This is Laura. Just a reminder to folks who are on the line, there is a little raised hand icon that you should see in your webinar controls. And if you click on that, I can prompt your line to be unmuted so that you can share or ask a question verbally. We also have the Q&A pod that you can type a question into and I can ask it on your behalf. And so Summer, I did have a question about sustainability and if you think your agency will be using this long term.
That's a great question, and it's a very important question to ask. You know, working in our agency back here at home, we have a lot of services to provide, and you know, everybody's really busy with our normal roles and duties as social workers and child welfare workers. So this project was handed to me in addition to my regular duties. So it's important that agencies, as you build on your GIS system, and that you really need to incorporate somebody that can do that. This is just what they do, is the GIS work, because you're constantly updating data. You're updating your spreadsheets. It's an everyday thing. So that's an important piece. The other piece is building really strong relationships with the other programs that you're going to be working with. That is part of the sustainability, because the more people that you can get to buy into what you're doing and using a system like GIS, it just adds to the strength. It adds to the buy-in from everybody. So I hope and I am confident right now that our agency will continue to use GIS. We've done a lot of work in the last 2.5 years, and we've gotten some really great products from it that are useful tools. And I think the agency is really excited about continuing to work with GIS.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question came in for you, Summer. Is the information being used to link to information about local customs and traditions? So an example would be rural country etiquette versus urban and suburban, and will that trigger needs for training?
I would say yes, it would. That's the thing about using GIS is it's so broad because there's so many different things that you can use. It's really up to the agency to sit down, or whatever program is thinking of using GIS. The first thing you want to do is you want to sit and identify the questions that your agency has. So if you do have a need where, like the example given is a question that the agency is constantly working on, then once you have your question, you'll have an idea, and it'll give you a direction of what the information is you're looking for to help find the solution. So, I mean, we've come up as an agency, we've had questions that we didn't think we would find or even begin to find in a solution for, because we just thought they were maybe they didn't apply to what we were doing in child welfare. But as we worked through it, we found that it did, and we were able to find, you know, some more creative thinking and thinking outside of the box type things. So GIS is a great, useful tool. It really is.
Right. And with Summer, when we first went there, they had a list of questions, and they evolved, as Summer was just stating. And they constantly evolved as we were working through the project. That what was nice is Summer would sometimes look at me and say, well, Catherine, what should I put in here? Is it a 10-mile? Do I care about what's going on in 10 miles or 20 miles? And I had to say to Summer, it's your data, and you've got to make sense of what makes sense to you. And it was really a way to empower understanding what was going on in her own community, because 20 miles for me in DC is one thing. 20 miles in South Dakota, as I learned from going out there, means something very, very different. And so she was able to take the data and to actually answer the questions that made meaningful sense to her own community, which is a nice flexibility with the data, where sometimes you just see large state trends and you could really personalize what was going on. So I don't think we have any more questions, so we can move on to John and doing sense of place.
Wokiapi. Ampetu kile chante wogapi no chum mape ne choose. It's a Lakota greeting. So all the participants, I appreciate your attendance, and I kind of got to look at the list, and it's quite diverse, I would say, geographically. I see a great interest. So that really excites me. You know, you heard Summer mentioning John and Catherine. Well, you know, behind that is a lot of other people that, you know, supported all of us too. So it's an effort that we've been endeavoring on for the last few years, traveling through Indian country. But giving you a little more background about myself, I been promoting GIS, I don't know, nigh on since the early 90s. And I've seen the technology really grow and how pervasive it is today. But when I first was exposed to the technology, I knew right away it was sort of like relevant to Indian country, especially because we are so land-based right now, with history left us on our reservations. That's what we have to manage, you know. So, but the technology in itself, to me, in its essence, is very ancient. So, the idea of a sense of place, you know, what this technology really embraces. I heard a term here recently through the big corporation called ESRI, the science of where, you know. I like that term because really the idea of this technology really defining for us how we see things and relate to it, and utilizing ancestral knowledges and stuff like that, that establishes a continuum of actually understanding the knowledge of home. And it's a natural for all cultures around the world to have this powerful connection based on, let's say, an origin story. In particular, Native people, we all have an emergence story or a creation story. It really defines us and our identity, you know. So that's really important to really kind of make that connection again. And I would say this technology or this new tool actually helps solidify that sense of place. But more so when we start looking at it in its form of actually how we can use it, it's that wherewithal that we have within us that kind of drives us all as Indigenous people. You know, our business case is in perpetuity. So things that we do, we think of the collective, we think of our people, you know. So this, like I said, when I first understood this technology, this information system, it really is empowering. And so these words that we use today, like sovereignty and such like this technology is a great fit for forward thinking and being proactive, really taking our governance to a higher level. But also it has this ability, what we call preservation, especially when I say child welfare through mapping, you know, like that is our most valuable resource. So we have to figure out how we use advancing technologies, information systems for that same purpose of preservation, and especially as Native culture, as I know it, we are a child-centric society. So child welfare is a perfect fit for what I see this technology can do. Now let's go to the next slide. I like to talk about a sense of continuity that we have in understanding our place. You know, Summer mentioned, you know, some things about this idea of spatial reasoning. That's the term I use, but it's a sense of understanding where we are historically and even on into the future. So these next few slides will be kind of expressing this continuity that we're already involved in. But as a young researcher many years ago, I came across this map drawn in the late 1800s by one of our Lakota. He was famous for preserving a lot of our information, our societies, ceremonies in drawings. But in this collection of his drawings was this map. So this map really defines a sacred area in our homeland called the Black Hills, Haisapa. But you can see this map, you know, of course there's some numbers on there, but that was just defining a legend for what these places really are. But you can see the glyphs within this area of the Black Hills. That really is one of our ways of communicating information, was through glyphs, you know, but those glyphs actually are like icons today. You can click on that, and behind that is a lot of information and stories. But this particular map really, even when I first discovered it, it was really intriguing because one of our stories talks about the great race around the Black Hills. You know, so you can see that red racetrack and of course all the sacred sites. But this particular map, as I studied it more and more, you can see the importance of hydrology. You can see all the water that percolates out of the discharging areas of the Black Hills into the creeks and into the streams and into the rivers that eventually merge with the Missouri River and on into the Mississippi River. So this is one area that showed the importance of water percolating out of the Black Hills, hydrating the prairies. But also historically in our own traditions, this great race served a purpose for helping us understand, because at one time in our story there was great predatory chaos in the world, and the Creator devised a race for all the creatures of the world to come, and He laid out a racetrack. So all the creatures of the world were running around this track laid out for them. And of course, as the race was happening, other animals were being trampled, and so it left this red ring around the Black Hills. As this race was happening, this, I call it, geological event was happening. The rocks were starting to pile up in the middle of this racetrack. So that's another thing, that's a phenomenon that we understand, is the uplift of the Black Hills. And we can see in this photograph to the left, to the right, is you can see the red racetrack around this other image from space. And this was taken by the astronaut John Arrington, the first native astronaut. And he took this picture of the Black Hills. So when I seen these juxtaposed to one another, it really kind of, I don't know, I guess I would say blew me away. Because here we are, a map that was drawn in the 1800s and the photo taken in the 2000. They're of the same scale. So how is it that this map in the 1800s was of the same scale? But it's because people walked the land. They knew everything about the land. And with that knowledge, they're able to see holistically across a great area, knowing where everything was. All the rivers, streams, creeks, all the resources for cultural resources, ceremonial resources, food sources, all of that. With that kind of knowledge, we're able to see holistically across a landscape and draw a map. So when you see a map on the picture on the other side, yes, all the technology and its wherewithal, a lot of people don't really know the knowledge from the micro to the macro, But there are other sensors in the sky that can actually see things, but it takes the critical thinking, the critical eye to start looking at the Earth again. So GIS is just one of the technologies that's merging with other technologies, remote sensing, global positioning systems and such like that. But the geographic information system in Indian country, to me, is part of the ancestral models that were already established with us. So as a culture that's been evolving, adapting, I think the technology of geographic information systems is just one more adaptation to a tool that we can use to serve our purpose and understand our place again. So that goes with our theme about the sense of place, the knowledge of home. Let's move to the next slide. So you heard me mention this little bit of a continuum. After I understood that first map and what Amos Van Hartbull was presenting, that map was developed with a collective of intellects, But then also the idea of map making evolved later to, let's say, the post-reservation days. But here we are, we'll talk, this is like 1915. When I seen this picture of this gentleman named Big Turkey, he was drawing a map. And the purpose of this map was to help all the missionaries that were coming to help the Lakota people. They didn't know where the Lakota people were, where the communities were. So as I read in this book, this gentleman here, he drew a map of the Lakota Nation, where all the communities were. So that kind of information, geographic information, he was developing right now, because he knew all the transportation lanes. He knew all the rivers and lakes and things like that. So that was incorporated into this map. So maps are visual to knowledge that people had and shared and communicated with. So you can see this evolution of spatial information from ancestral time to emerging contemporary time starting to happen. Let's go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, this continuum today, and as Summer kind of mentioned, you know, there are tribes already that are using GIS. And like I said, I got my start in the early 90s, but prior to that, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had been implementing GIS with tribes that were resource rich. And so they were developing what I call integrated resource management plans, and that was to manage their forestry products, gas and oil and mining, things like that, that were part of this developing the resources on tribal lands. While the technology in its infancy, geographic information systems evolved out of Canada, and it was more like a land information system. Well, that's what the Bureau of Indian Affairs was developing for tribes and implementing with tribes. They developed a lot of the data off of United States Geological Survey maps, which were digitized back then. You know, so they had presented tribes with layers of data showing maps of roads, hydrology, different contour maps, things like that. So maps were starting to get digitized and put into computer systems, but they were just still managing the natural resources. But this continuum that I've seen of tribal uses of GIS has been evolving. And today, I do know that the younger generation, in fact, I've met them, and my colleagues here have also met them at the Intertribal GIS conference in Albuquerque. There's a core of young users, developers. They have grasped the technology and have actually used it for cultural purposes. So many of the tribal historic preservation offices are using the technology, the mapping technology. All the data they collect is in how they can identify cultural areas for preservation and such, and even for management. You know, all the cell towers that are being installed all across the country, they are disturbing our archaeological resources. So this is just one way of tribal people being proactive because of the federal authorities that ask for tribal input and consultation. So this core of young tribal users using GIS can respond to those requests, you know, for actually doing archaeological surveys and identifying cultural areas close to such any kind of energy development or such. So this is causing us to be more proactive to land management, but also preserving cultural resources. So I just thought I'd let people know that, you know, tribes have been using this, and as Summer mentioned, you know, just discovering her own tribe, well, that's causing us to really understand the whole idea of data that we all have and we're starting to use. So you would know that public safety has a database of all the roads and houses, so does the tribe. Well, that's critical information for, you know, child welfare services, for protecting children, recruitment for foster homes. I mean, so you think of all that data, the information that everybody's using, how collectively bringing that data and integrating it with good management, causing government to be more proactive than reactive. You know, so that's really the point I wanted to get across, you know, about this technology. Like I said, the science of where, you know, is kind of, not that it's a real science to Native people, but it's really important because we were evolving for 10,000 years as cultures, relying on critical information and to make wise decisions. But here we are again with a new tool. And that's something I know that we are really good at, is adapting technology and tools into our culture. So here's one more that I think is an easy fit. Let's go to the next slide. There's a really all-entailing word, this resilience, is the capacity to anticipate, prepare, and recover from issues. Greater awareness of issues through visual display of data. That's what we've been talking about here. And assisting managing the resources and identifying cultural connections. So, like I said, the historic preservation officers that are using it, that's one of the stronger cultural connections that we have. It kind of connects us with our ancestral processes, understanding the evolution of our culture, how we still have to care for our ancestors, what they have left us, the resources they've left us. But importantly, words come out like empowerment, self-determination. And I think this tool, and I like to talk about it as a tool, when you start talking about it and using words like technology and all that, it does kind of impede anybody, scares them. I know we're with a generation of leaders right now that didn't really, let's say, grow up with computers, but we are in an era right now where I know a lot of younger people aren't afraid of it, but with purpose, I think the technologies, can bring us to a point of being critical thinkers again and looking at ways of creating solutions. But right now, this tool for how we can use it helps inform leadership, leading us on that path towards, sovereignty, really looking at the real concept of sovereignty, looking at data or information as an investment in how we can actually use that information to create solutions. And of course, like I mentioned, that requires some critical thinking. So right now we are at a crux, I think, of really understanding where we can go, collectively. And I have dreams and visions about this technology, what it can really mean. But I think all of you as participants in this workshop, I'm hoping that we can pique your interest to go further, to understand. And I know we are poised to talk more about all this and see how it really applies to Indian country. But like I had mentioned, I had been involved in this for a long time. And the initial experience I had with the GIS was helping with a treaty up in British Columbia. So if you can imagine how critical maps were for the treaty process in British Columbia, showing Indigenous maps that were born from the internal to the external. These maps defined their Aboriginal territories, incorporating traditional knowledge, cultural resources, traditional foods, medicinal plants, and clan systems. All these kind of things actually have us really defining the world in a more real humanistic way, so. But this idea of building resilience and enhancing child welfare, that's really what this workshop that we're doing right now is all about. So I know the audience we have here, hopefully that what we're talking about really helps you have a vision about how this technology can help with child welfare. It is a management tool. It is a tool where we can communicate to our leadership through maps or something like that, really enhancing our stories that we have. And that's another way I see data. Talking about data, not so much as the term data, but relevant stories that mean something. And now we have pictures to go along with relevant stories. Well, our next slide is a question and discussion. Maybe hopefully this little talk here created some kind of questions, but even if you have comments, we appreciate that too.
It's really great to hear John give the historical perspective of how this all connects and how this new technology has always been so ingrained into Indian country. There is a question here that came through that says, what are the risks to Indian country when using GIS? And I think that's like all data. And I think John and Summer can agree that who are you giving your data to? How are you protecting your data? How are they using your data? Can your data be used against you? I think are all questions that need to be concerned within your own agency. John and Summer, do you have something to agree?
Yeah, I do. And I think that's a really good question, because when you start, I mean, the idea of using data against you, yeah, but then you really have to be cognizant about understanding the technology, because if you can, data is the point of it all, you know. And I do know that this brings us into a whole nother discussion about how you protect your data too, you know, because and what are the policies within your organization to really protect your data. But as far as using data against you, you know, that's, I think how you protect your data is actually probably one of the solutions to that too. But I do know that there are greater discussions going on about data, looking at decolonizing data, because think of all the data that's always been developed about Native peoples, about kind of the dark side of the Indian people is, you know, all the disparaging data that we have, how poor we are, you know, how we're encumbered by social ills and such. But, you know, how do we turn that around? There again, the data is the point of it all.
As for our agency, that was a really big conversation that we had, because there's so many different elements when it comes to data. And not only do you want, you know, to be able to protect confidentiality, and that's something that I'll get into in some of the upcoming slides, but confidentiality is a huge responsibility of anybody who's collecting data on, you know, our communities and our relatives in our communities, you know, that we're able to protect their information. So you got to really develop some pretty clear and strict policies about how you collect data and how you share data.
Summer, your tribe has an IRB already set up.
Right, yep. And that was really helpful. And they were actually creating the IRB when we started doing this project. And, you know, it gives the tribe, like John had mentioned, it gives us control over our own information and who's coming in to use that information and what are they using that information for. And is it for the benefit of our community members? So having that IRB was really, really important to in relationship to this project.
And then I think that's a perfect segue into Summer going into her applying the GIS and how she started to move through and what her challenges were in South Dakota. Because challenges in South Dakota are much different than around here. And they were eye-awakening to me.
Well, so applying the GIS has been very interesting, to say the least. It gets me really excited. I love research. I love digging into information and things like that. So this part of GIS was something that really intrigued me. We can go ahead and go to, so some of the questions in regards to some of the challenges, you know, you have to sit down with all of the decision makers within your agency, the administration, the directors, supervisors, and you know, all your coworkers. You have to be able to sit down and come up with a set of questions that you want answers to. That was the first thing that we did. And GIS came to us at a really important time, because the Rosebud Sioux Tribe has applied and was approved for to receive Title IV-E federal funding. So right now, the agency that I work for, Sicangu Child and Family Services, we're a placement agency. So we work with the state and our ICWA department to help recruit family members, community members, foster families, and get them licensed and prepared to provide care for children. So applying for this 4E funding will help push us forward to becoming our own tribal child welfare agency. So finding GIS and having this opportunity to build this project came just at the right time, because we needed more tools to help us get through this. And I mean, I'm so proud of the agency that I work for, because for the last 5 years, I mean, they've been putting time and energy into creating new policies and procedures, updating and changing our law and order code, creating trainings and orientations for employees. And those are all things that GIS can help you do, because GIS can help you organize the information that you already have, and help you find solutions that I think a lot of tribal agencies are really looking for, because for so long we've been doing child welfare a certain way. Applying for the 4E funding really allowed us an opportunity to get creative and kind of create this wish list as a tribe. Is how do we as Rosebud want to do child welfare? What does that look like for us? So if you, on the screen in the upper left-hand corner, oftentimes this is how we see information. It's just something in front of us on a paper, and it's got numbers and graphs and things like that. So in South Dakota, we have a population of around 900,000 people total in South Dakota. And tribes and native peoples take up about, I'd say about 8 to 9% of that total population. So when you're looking at this graph, it shows that Native American and Alaska Native children represent 49% of the total children in child welfare. So when we looked at that, and we looked at all of these other, sources of information that we had, and it was just like, how does that relate to where we are in Rosebud? So when you apply that type of information to a map, like in the bottom half or the bottom lower right corner of the screen, it shows the state of South Dakota, and it shows just all of the geography that is in between each reservation. And so it showed us, we were able to say, okay, so where are children coming from? Where are these referrals coming from? And so some of them showed up, in the more urban, I don't want to say urban in South Dakota, but in some of the bigger towns and cities. And so when we apply the geography to that data, it really shows us our relationship to where those referrals were coming from into our agency. It helped us identify what other resources do we need, because in Rosebud, we're in the central part of South Dakota, the south central part, right on like the Nebraska-South Dakota border. And at any given day, our social workers can travel to Sioux Falls, which is about 4 hours away from Rosebud, and back. So round trip, that's an 8-hour trip. And our social workers make that in one day, We travel all over the state in one day. So being able to look at where we are, where we're located in relation to where we need to be to make visits to our families, to provide resources for the children, it really helped show us that there's, you know, we got a lot of ground to cover. How do we apply that to maximizing and utilizing our social workers and our staff to maximize the time and the resources that we have? So that generated a whole different list of questions for us, but it was really important questions. One of them was, does it make more sense for us to travel to one home and then back to the office and get information, leave and travel to another home? Or does it make more sense for us to travel to an eastern part of the state, make every face-to-face meeting that we need to have and check up on the families in one day, spend the night and, you know, cover all of one area and then come back to the office? So it helped us ask some questions about how, you know, how do we spend our money? What's the most efficient way to spend the money that our agency receives? The other thing is, you know, in relationship to probably the most important question that comes to our agency is, where are the children? All of the leadership and the decision makers within the tribe, you know, anytime there's a meeting with our agency, it's, well, where are the children? And that's the most important question, because as an agency, we need to be able to say, here's where they are, and then ask further questions of why they're in that place. And so everybody that does child welfare work, you know that there's a whole laundry list of things that you have to consider when it comes to placing children. So what we wanted to do was, we wanted to look at a few different things. One of them was, where were they? And the other thing was, where do we need to recruit and license more families? You know, and that's birth relatives, distant relatives, community members, foster families. Where do we need to go? And in addition to that, where are the best resources in relationship to those families? That was something that we initially made a priority. Some questions that we asked were in regards to the resources. This was really cool, and we didn't realize this was going to happen, but it was a great reminder. So when we were looking at where are all the resources, we had to do an inventory in our area around Rosebud. Where were the resources? So you're looking at schools, hospitals, dental clinics, food services, all of them. And what we realized is that Rosebud has a lot of these resources locally. And sometimes we tend to look outside of that. So it was a great reminder that we have a lot of resources that we can provide to our families. So it goes back to what John had talked about, is that resiliency and that empowerment that comes from being able to analyze and reflect back on the things that we have locally. And by building those relationships from our agency to these other agencies that provide services and resources locally, we're building each other up, and we're building our own system of care up, which is so important, because we want to be able to keep our families together. We want to be able to keep the children in their homes, with their families, with their relatives, in their communities. That is very, very important to us. And so by being able to keep those families here and outsource our local resources was great for us. So having to do that inventory, you know, they were already there. All we had to do was find it and revisit it. And then when you plot it on the map, I tell you, it just paints a whole different picture for you when you put these things on a map. Because then you realize there's a school 1 mile from our office. So we know that naturally, right? But then when you look on a map and it's just like, oh, it just creates a different visual and a different understanding of where things are. So it's been, there's a lot of different steps that you take to really get to plotting points on a map. There's a whole step of thinking things through, asking questions, prioritizing which questions you wanna look at and investigate before you actually get to making those points on a map. Next slide. So this just getting back to what did we want to learn about our communities? What data do I have? And this goes back to recognizing there was other departments that were already using GIS, but more importantly within our agency, and a lot of people can maybe relate to this, but we've got boxes of files from years, and there is so much great information about the families you've worked with, about the young relatives that you've worked with, just sitting in our own office. So that was the great thing about all of this, is I really didn't have to go very far to find the information that I needed. And then once you have the questions that you want to ask, it helps you guide what information you're looking for, because when you're just looking through things and looking through files, there's all kinds of information there, and it's time consuming. So if you have the questions that you are already looking for, it helps guide and saves time, because it's like, oh, there's this great information, but I don't need that right now because that's not what we're looking for. So it helps keep you on track, because this takes time. And that's why, back to the question about sustainability, you're thankfully my agency supported this work. So in addition to doing my everyday duties, I was also given time to do the digging, to do the investigating, to compile the information, put them into spreadsheets, because Excel was not my favorite thing, but now we've become friends and I'm pretty handy with Excel now. But you've got to, that's how you use Excel, and that's how you organize your data. And then when whatever software you're using, that's how the two things communicate with each other. So if you have somebody that is really, really great in Excel, that's a step up. I wasn't. And so thankful to like Catherine and the other people at the Capacity Building Center for Tribes. They helped me walk through it, and all of my frustration, and the days I'd call Catherine, like, Catherine, the Excel isn't reading this right. What am I not doing? So, so being familiar with working with spreadsheets and how to organize your data within that spreadsheet is really important too. Because when you get into the software to start creating your maps, that's what the software, communicates with all your spreadsheet information, and that's where it pulls it from. So, yeah?
As the data is organized, it becomes pretty powerful, right?
It does. It is, and we've got some other samples that we can show you. The most simple map that I made was just, when I presented it back to my coworkers at the office, it was just, they were like, wow. Because every day we talk about, oh, I got to go here. We got to go here today. I got to make this visit. I got to do this transport. And then when you look on the map and you look at the places where you have to go, it's like, wow, okay. So where do we need to go? And how much time do we need? How much time do we have? How accessible are we to our families? That is important, because our families have a lot of challenges. And so us being flexible and being accessible to our families is so important. So not only does this information drive us to problem solve, from the agency's point of view, but it also helps us be aware and to build on the services, so that way our families have access to us. So the slide that's up now is it's a sample map. There's no real data. But what we did, this was the first thing when we were asking ourselves, where are our licensed foster families? So we plotted them on a map, and there was our points. That's you know, like an example of what's being shown. And our agency works throughout the state of South Dakota, and also when we help our ICWA department. So we've got families that are outside of South Dakota, all over the United States, that our social workers have to travel to. So when we put it on a map and I put it up and showed it to everybody, it was just kind of like this, like, realization of where we are in relationship to all the places that we have to go. And that immediately, just in that setting, in that meeting, just generated all these great questions about accessibility and saving time, you know, maximizing our time. Because driving on the road, I've been to Denver and back in one day. That's like a 13-hour trip. So it's hard on us having to travel. So what are things that we can do to also support the well-being of social workers? Because we all know, like, social workers have hard jobs. Agencies have hard jobs. So what can we do to also support social workers while making sure that our families are receiving services? So the next question that we asked ourselves was, okay, these are the families that we have. Where do we need to increase our recruitment? And so there's, oh, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So this, what we did in relationship to this, so these are the families. So then it went back to, how do we use GIS to help us make better placement decisions? So if we have a child that comes in, you know, there's kind of a wait time from the time, if a child has to be removed from the time they're placed. And so that was one of the questions asked: how do we minimize that time? Because we want to minimize the trauma. They're already having to experience the trauma of being removed. How do we also minimize that wait period of keeping them where they don't know what's going on, and either get them with a relative, you know, a community member, somebody they might be familiar with, or into one of the our licensed foster homes. So we thought, even past that, and well, in a kind of a more basic point of view, was where are the resources in relationship to where our children are placed. So if you have a child that's placed and maybe they're in, you know, first grade, maybe they have some challenges, like maybe they're hearing impaired, or they need some speech therapy, counseling, things like that. So we were able to, once we identified all of these resources, we were able to apply the resource layer on top of our layer that had our licensed foster homes. And we created a radius, say, okay, what resources are around this family within like 10 miles? And we can go to the next slide. And that's what it looked like. So the black dots are the families that we have licensed. The dark green area was that 10-mile, 20-mile radius. So we were able, now when you have the resource layer on there that we don't have, you're gonna have other points pop up that will show schools nearby, that will show clinics, mental health clinics. They'll show these different resources. So if there's things within that radius that child needs, it helps us make better placement decisions. Because we don't want to place a child that has some really high needs into one of the more rural areas or isolated areas where a family is. It doesn't make, you know, it just doesn't make sense. It's not going to be the best decision for the child. So the light green radius around the points, we went out further. It's like a 50-mile radius, because in rural areas, those resources are spread out. You know, so we were able to use this as a way to help us make quicker placement decisions.
And Summer, the important part was too, when we were doing maps like this with the real data, not with the dummy data that we're showing right now,
right,
that Summer asked me, well, what's acceptable? Is 10 miles acceptable, 20 miles? And I said to her, I don't know. It's up to you to decide what's an acceptable thrive
Right.
based on the community, based on the urbanicity, based on the resources, what is acceptable to you? Because it's going to be different in every part of the country.
Right. Yep. Yeah, so you know, and that's the great thing about GIS is you apply it to where, you know, your area, and you know, everybody's different. The geography is so different. I can travel 3 miles south and have a totally different geography makeup than what I do where I'm at. You know, so it's really useful to be able to look at that and see how it affects our ability to function. Next slide. So when we were talking about confidentiality, this map really shows that this is just a sample map. And so when we're able to say, like, say we're wanting to share this with like council, tribal council, or maybe our board members or something like that, we don't want to show them a map that has the specific points of where the families are located. So this is a way, using the GIS system, that you can mask that information, so you can give some roundabout or estimate information rather than the identifying information. That helps protect people's confidentiality. So on this map, each color represents not a precise number, but in that area there's a certain number of families, but it doesn't tell you where. So like in the white area, we don't have any. So this map tells us two different things, and I'll go through that. The light blue areas, there's 2 or less. There's nothing, you know, there's nothing more than 2. And the light green, it goes up 4. The next green, there's 6, and then the dark green, there's like 9 or more, or 8 or more. So you're able to look at a zip code and say, in this area, we've got 9 families, but it doesn't tell you where. So you're protecting their identifying information. The other thing that this map shows us, when we were going back to talking about recruitment, was obviously we need to get to these areas of white because we don't have families in those areas. So it helped us identify where we need to go to up our recruitment efforts. Just to kind of add a few things before I pass on the slide is, you got, if there's an agency or if there's people that are interested in doing GIS work, you can absolutely do it. It does take some learning, it does take some training, but there's people in your communities that can help you. And also the Capacity Center Building for Tribes was so important to getting me to this place where I'm at, because it can be intimidating when you first start out. If you've never worked with any of this type of stuff, if you have, great, you know, you're kind of one step ahead of the game. But you can absolutely build a system for your agency or whatever program that you're working with to help get creative, to help our families, to help our children. The important piece for me was being able to problem solve and to create that resilience within our agency and our communities and our families, and to also the data sovereignty. That was huge for me, because I've worked in many different fields, and we do have people that come in, collect all this information, and then it's used for purposes that aren't always for the benefit of tribes. And so by creating that IRB, our tribe really took that step to saying, we are going to have our own control over this. And so as an agency, as a tribe, if you build your GIS department and your system, and you have this plethora of data, but it's coming from our point of view, and it's coming from our lived experiences, and it's being interpreted through that lens and not somebody else's lens. It gives so much power to the resiliency, to the future of how we create and structure and organize our programs, and how we offer services and how we build relationships. The other thing that is really, really important is being able to build relationships within Indian country, not just within your own tribe, but being able to network with other tribes. That's huge, because we all know that, you know, funding, there's competition. And the more we can network together throughout Indian country and build these programs, it just gives us more of a voice, and it gives us more power and more authority over what we do in our own nations. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe you can keep going and going, but I'm available if anybody has further questions or wants to have more conversations about this. Our contact information will be shared, but I really thank everybody for listening to me talk.
John, do you want to give up some closing thoughts as people have gathered their thoughts for any discussion or questions coming through?
We would like to hear any more questions or comments, but thank you, Summer. You did summarize it again in that last slide, all the things that I was starting to mention. But I think we all, as presenters, connected to show an emerging vision for child protective services and family restoration and such, is because, to me, I see this, like I mentioned, as a proactive technology that has, for us as Indigenous people, roots in a continuum of how data is really important, how information and knowledge, you know, is really important to the collective, and how we can make our communities better by connecting with one another through our different agencies through information, what we call data. You know, that's a new word, data. Kind of makes me wonder, you know, the idea of telling stories like the last slide mentioned. That's really what it is. How we visualize our stories and connect again through maps, which are stories in this. So, but you know, geography, many different words for it that we can use in our Indigenous language. Makoche Huapi is what we call in Lakota language, and that's the land. I guess that's the word for map, but it has its roots into a deeper connection about our place, sense of place. Makoche, where we belong to this land, you know, and all of us protecting the land, protecting ourselves. That's kind of the way I do this technology. Like I said, I've seen this in its infancy back in the early 90s and made that connection, and it still has the same relevance to me. As long as I've been in it, I'm still advocating for it. I'm very still passionate about it. Right now, there are projects being envisioned by younger tribal GIS users, so that's something that I guess we're starting as this continuum and this network, you know. But we're really glad that we have a project that really wants to bring a solution to child welfare. So we can open it up to any comments or questions.
So we had a question that came in about confidentiality. And one of the things is with the zip code map that Summer showed is that when we were preparing the maps for Summer to show to her tribe, we made sure that we were following HIPAA standards, that you never just show one child per zip code, because that data is actually very traceable back even at a zip code level. So you have to make sure that your ranges are set correctly and that everything is protected correctly before you do any type of sharing out, because the children are the most vulnerable. So you want to make sure that they're safe and that the data you're not sharing And even at zip code level, sometimes then maybe you want to aggregate up to the county level, or you want to aggregate even higher to really protect it. So HIPAA has a whole list of standards, and those were the standards that we were following to do any maps that were going to be shared outside the agency. And it was important too, who actually even saw the maps within the agency. And Summer and I had a discussion about that too, because not everybody needs to see this information, because it is really powerful when it's displayed, and you want to make sure that that is protected.
Yeah, and thanks for reminding me of that, Catherine, because one of the things when you're trying to get into your data share agreements with other programs, you have to be really specific about who looks at that data, and provide training for them, because if I'm looking at data from the housing department for locations of houses, I have to be able to understand what housing's regulation was for that and respect that. And then they have to understand ours. So that way we're not breaching any type of confidentialities on both sides. And that part gets, it gets really tedious, because you have to have specific language within your agreements, but it is there to protect the individuals and also there to protect the agencies too. So, because you don't want to get into a HIPAA violation or anything like that as an agency. So those data sharing agreements are really important to have.
And there was another question that came into the chat box about any other data. And I think that the nice thing is any other data that's being collected through child welfare. And the nice thing is any data that's got a geographic marker to it, which is a lot of data. It could be zip code, county level data, state level data. Depending on what you're trying to answer, we can start to interpret it spatially. And as we continue to grow and continue to grow these projects, you start to bring in more spatial statistics. You start to bring in more areas where not only are you looking at the dots on the map, you can prove that there's a cluster here. You can prove that more needs to be going on here. And we're at the beginning steps. The beginning steps are really powerful, but then as Summer continues to grow, the more data that she starts to integrate and to bring in, it makes it more powerful to make a case, and to make a case that's irrefutable to what questions that they're asking.
Right. And one of the other parts of using GIS as a tool, which is really interesting for me, is being able to get to a point where we can kind of predict things that might happen when you start looking at the trends of different things within the community. We all know that the 12-month year, depending on the season, depending on the school year, depending on when kids get us, there's so many different things that trigger some types of behaviors that often end up with a child coming into contact with our agency. So when we're able to even track that kind of stuff over a period of time, we get to a point where we'll be able to say, okay, we're getting into September, October, November. In the past 5 years, these are the scenarios or situations that we've seen. How do we prepare for them? The other thing too is we're able to look at crime statistic. And so if we had a certain community that had, a high number of, say, domestic violence calls in, a 2-month period, 2-3-month period, it helped us be like, okay, what services can we provide to that community to address some of those issues? So, like I said, there's really a lot of really interesting things that you can do once you start getting, further and further into how you can utilize your data and use the system to help you do that.
And for our friends in the South, for disaster planning, and for all the communities in Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas who are getting flooded right now by the hurricane, just knowing where your children are can help you really help identify them. So depending on what natural disasters are in your area, just knowing if it's fires or it's floods or earthquakes, it can be used for multiple uses.
Yeah, and one of the, one of the other things that we've kind of added on into this is creating a response for when a child is either reported as a runaway or they're missing. So that's a response that our agency wants to really build, so that way we have, a system in place to activate if something like that comes up. So being able to use GIS in that manner has been super helpful. And also, with the missing and murdered Indigenous women awareness that's been happening, being able to create that response. I know Rosebud has been able to work on a response for that using GIS. So it's, you can really apply this to a lot of different things, and it's super, super helpful.
Right, well, I'll jump in here just to say thank you to our panelists for what I found to be an incredibly interesting and really rich discussion. Thank you so much. And I hope that everyone attending has also found it to be equally interesting and that it left you wanting more information on GIS, more information on what you can do with your program data to support your practice. So we are just about out of time. And I just want to hit a couple of highlights here on the resources that the Center for Tribes offers. The main thing I want to point out is that we have a wonderful website called the Tribal Child Welfare Information Exchange, which is located at tribalinformationexchange.org. And you can find many resources on a number of topics. And if you go up to the Child Welfare Practice tab, you'll see that there is an entire section on data, which has some great resources. Just show you very quickly on GIS and tribal child welfare. We have some great products on that, and another webinar that we did a year or two ago that's worth checking out. Summer mentioned the importance of having your data ready to go for GIS and how that's not always as easy as it seems. So we have a great series on using Excel, and it can take you right from just an absolute beginner, you've never opened the program before, not even sure if you have it on your computer, all the way to be able to do advanced formulas to help manage your data.
Yep.
We also have the River of Data series, which talks a lot about things you can do with your data, how to use it to communicate, and another series on building a data system or enhancing a data system. Okay, and with that, I will say thank you all for coming. And if you would like to contact us at all for anything, either to get in touch with our speakers, or if you are interested in requesting services from the Center for Tribes, we have a few different ways to get through that door. Any door will work. We have a phone number, we have an email address, or you can contact any Center for Tribes staff member. And if you enjoy scanning QR codes as much as I do, we also have a feedback survey here that we would really appreciate you giving us your feedback on how we did today. And I think that might also go out in an email. Laura, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, I will be sharing links to all of the resources that were included here today, some additional information about GIS and where you can access that, and the feedback survey via email right after this webinar concludes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.